It was a quiet morning in Meadow Creek, a small town surrounded by endless fields and dense woods. Sergeant Daniel Harris, a veteran of the local police department, was driving along the dirt road that ran through the state park. Soft sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dancing shadows on the ground. It was just another routine patrol, at least that's what he thought. Something deep inside him sensed that today would be different. As he slowed down near a hiking trail, Daniel noticed something unusual up ahead. A small German shepherd puppy, with shiny black fur and brown markings on his paws, stood in the middle of the path, staring directly at the approaching car. Daniel gently hit the brakes and stepped out of the vehicle, curious. The puppy didn't run away. Instead, he cautiously approached, his tail wagging just a little hesitantly. He seemed nervous, as if searching for something or someone. "Hey there, little guy. What are you doing out here all alone?" Daniel asked softly, kneeling down to avoid scaring the pup. The puppy took a few uncertain steps toward him before letting out a soft whimper. Daniel immediately noticed that this wasn't just a lost dog. There was something deeper in its eyes, a mix of desperation and hope. As the puppy finally drew closer, Daniel saw that the dog's fur was dusty and smeared with dirt, as though he'd been wandering through the woods for hours. The little pup nudged Daniel's leg with his nose and let out a short bark, almost as if he was trying to say something. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Instinctively, he knew this puppy wasn't here by chance. In that moment, he gave him a name, Tucker. "All right, Tucker. Let's see what you need," Daniel murmured, gently stroking the pup's head. Tucker's eyes softened, and he seemed to relax for the first time. When Daniel stood up, Tucker immediately followed him, refusing to leave his side. It was like the dog had found the only person he could trust. But what did he want to show him? Why did he seem so determined to stay close? Daniel decided to follow Tucker's lead. As they walked down the trail, the pup kept glancing back to make sure Daniel was still there. Something in the forest was hidden, something that Tucker was desperate to reveal. Daniel's curiosity grew with each step. He had no idea that what he was about to discover would change everything. Tucker wasn't just a lost puppy. He carried a truth that would lead Daniel down a path filled with emotional twists and turns. Hidden in the depths of those soulful eyes was the key to a story no one could have anticipated. Daniel continued to follow Tucker as the puppy led him deeper into the woods. The path became narrower, and the towering trees around them grew denser, their branches interlocking above like a ceiling of shadows. The air grew colder, carrying the faint, earthy scent of moss and wet bark. Daniel could hear the soft rustling of leaves underfoot, but aside from that, the forest was eerily still. Tucker, however, was unwavering. His small paws moved quickly, and he occasionally glanced back to make sure Daniel hadn't fallen behind. There was no hesitation in the puppy's movements. He had a destination in mind, and Daniel had no choice but to trust him. "All right, Tucker, where are we going?" Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the woods. Tucker didn't respond with another bark or whimper. Instead, he pushed forward, weaving through the undergrowth until they reached a small clearing. Daniel stopped a few feet behind, observing the area. It felt strangely untouched, almost frozen in time. Sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. Daniel's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Tucker suddenly stopped near a fallen tree and began sniffing the ground with an intensity that made Daniel's stomach tighten. The pup's ears twitched, and a soft, mournful whine escaped his throat. Daniel quickened his pace, approaching cautiously. His eyes scanned the clearing until they locked onto something half-buried in a pile of leaves near the base of the fallen tree. It was a small, crumpled jacket, child-sized. Dirt and decay had stained its fabric, as if it had been lying there for days. Tucker pawed gently at the jacket and whimpered again, as if urging Daniel to pay attention. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He crouched beside the jacket and carefully lifted it, revealing more signs that someone had been there. A few scattered leaves disturbed by movement, a faint impression in the dirt. His mind raced. Whose jacket was this? How did it get here? He reached for his radio but hesitated before calling it in. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right. Tucker had led him straight to this spot, almost as if he'd known exactly where to go. Coincidences like that didn't happen. Daniel studied Tucker for a moment. The puppy sat quietly beside the jacket now, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow that tugged at Daniel's heart. It was as if Tucker understood the weight of what they had found but couldn't communicate it. The bond between them deepened in that moment. Tucker wasn't just any stray. He had witnessed something, or perhaps someone important, and he was trying to share that story in the only way he could. "Tucker, what happened here?" Daniel whispered, his voice thick with concern. He didn't expect an answer, of course, but the silence that followed seemed almost deafening. Tucker gave a low whimper and nudged the jacket with his nose again, reinforcing the sense that there was more to uncover. Daniel knew this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Somewhere in these woods, the truth was waiting, and Tucker was determined to lead him to it. Daniel folded the small jacket carefully, the weight of the discovery pressing heavily on his mind. The jacket was old and stained, clearly exposed to the elements for days. Tucker remained beside him, his eyes glued to the fabric as if trying to convey an important message. Daniel couldn't shake the thought, this wasn't random. Something or someone had brought this puppy here, and now it seemed Tucker was depending on him to understand. The officer's pulse quickened as scenarios played in his mind. Was there a child lost in these woods? Had something worse happened? He needed answers. Daniel stood and pulled his radio from his belt. His voice was steady, but the tension in his gut made him hyper-focused. Sergeant Harris reporting. Any recent missing persons reports involving children? Over. He listened to the static, waiting for dispatch to reply. Every second stretched, the silence of the forest amplifying the hum of the radio. Negative on local missing reports, Sergeant, the dispatcher replied after a pause. No active cases, but I can check the surrounding areas if needed. Daniel furrowed his brow and glanced back at the jacket. No missing person reports. That didn't sit right with him. He knew from experience that not all disappearances were reported immediately. He spoke again into the radio. Go ahead and check statewide alerts. I may have something here. Clicking the radio off, Daniel sighed heavily. He was no stranger to strange cases, and every instinct screamed that this discovery wasn't an accident. Before he could gather his thoughts, Tucker's ears shot up. The pup stood rigid, his nose pointing toward the edge of the clearing. A low, rumbling growl escaped from deep in his chest. Daniel followed Tucker's gaze, squinting to scan the tree line. The forest appeared still, yet a sensation of being watched crept over him. His hand hovered near his sidearm, tension surging through his body. Tucker took a few cautious steps forward, sniffing the air with sharp, deliberate movements. Whatever he sensed wasn't visible, but Daniel knew better than to ignore the warning. After a few moments, the tension slowly lifted. Daniel exhaled, patting Tucker's head gently. Let's keep moving, buddy. If there's more to this, we'll find it. Tucker gave a quiet bark of agreement and led the way forward, their steps echoing softly as the woods seemed to close in around them. The forest seemed to close in tighter around them as Daniel and Tucker pressed forward. The towering trees loomed higher, their gnarled branches intertwined like skeletal fingers above. Each step stirred faint whispers of fallen leaves and broken twigs. Daniel kept his eyes sharp, glancing between Tucker and the path ahead. The puppy was focused, his nose close to the ground, occasionally sniffing the air as if picking up a scent trail only he could detect. Daniel found himself trusting Tucker more with every passing moment. Tucker suddenly veered to the left, guiding Daniel off the main trail and deeper into the undergrowth. The terrain became rougher, with tangled roots snaking across their path. Daniel carefully navigated the uneven ground, his boots crunching softly on loose stones. His instincts told him they were heading toward something significant. The thought lingered as he observed Tucker's unwavering determination. It was as if the dog knew exactly where he was going, his small frame tense with purpose. After a few minutes, Tucker came to a halt near a tree with a large scar across its trunk. He barked twice, short and sharp, before pawing at the base of the tree. Daniel approached, wiping sweat from his brow. The air here was cooler, almost unnaturally so. As he crouched next to Tucker, his eyes caught something glinting faintly in the dirt. He brushed away a layer of dried leaves and uncovered a small metallic object, a charm bracelet. Its silver links were tarnished, and a delicate star-shaped charm dangled from the chain. Daniel picked up the bracelet, turning it over in his hands. It looked like something a child might wear. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of another clue. First the jacket, now this. Whoever owned these items had likely been in this area not long ago. But where were they now? The thought made his stomach tighten. His mind flashed with possibilities. Had they wandered deeper into the woods and gotten lost? Or had something more sinister happened here? Tucker let out another low whine, bringing Daniel back to the present. "Good job, buddy," Daniel said softly, pocketing the bracelet. Tucker wagged his tail lightly but stayed alert, his gaze darting around the clearing as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. Daniel's heart raced as he stood and took a deep breath. The deeper they ventured, the more questions piled up. He was no longer sure if he was tracking a missing person or unraveling a mystery that had gone unnoticed for too long. Either way, he was committed now. Daniel gave the area another long look, but there were no other immediate signs. He straightened and spoke quietly to Tucker. "All right, let's keep going. You're leading this mission now." Tucker barked softly in reply and resumed his place at Daniel's side. Together, they pressed forward once more, their path winding deeper into the forest's heart. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that every step brought them closer to a truth neither of them was fully prepared to face. The forest grew darker as Daniel and Tucker ventured deeper into its untouched depths. The canopy thickened, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor with every shift of the wind. The occasional call of a distant bird echoed through the trees, but otherwise, the silence was oppressive. Daniel's thoughts churned, piecing together the clues they had found. First the jacket, then the bracelet, both small but significant signs. Something terrible had happened here, and every instinct told him they were drawing closer to the truth. Tucker led the way without hesitation, his nose occasionally brushing the ground as he tracked an invisible scent. Suddenly, the pup froze, his body stiffening as a soft sound carried through the trees. Daniel stopped as well, straining to hear. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves. But then he heard it again, soft, uneven breathing. It was distant but unmistakable. His pulse quickened. Someone was out here. "Tucker, stay close," Daniel whispered, resting his hand near his holster. He scanned the dense forest ahead, his senses heightened. The breathing grew louder as they advanced, mixed with faint sniffles and the occasional rustle of movement. It sounded like a child. Daniel's thoughts raced. Could it be the owner of the jacket and bracelet? He had to proceed carefully. As they moved closer, Daniel spotted a figure partially obscured behind a thick tree trunk. It was small and hunched, trembling. Tucker's ears perked up, and he let out a soft bark. The figure jerked in response, shrinking back further into the shadows. Daniel raised his hands slowly in a gesture of peace. "Hey, it's okay," Daniel called out gently. "I'm here to help. You're not in trouble. My name's Daniel. This is Tucker." The puppy stepped forward cautiously, his tail wagging slightly as he gave a reassuring bark. Slowly, the figure peeked out from behind the tree. It was a young girl, no older than 7 or 8, with tear-streaked cheeks and wide, frightened eyes. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she clutched her knees to her chest. Daniel crouched down to her level, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You're safe now. We've been looking for you," he said softly. Tucker approached her slowly, wagging his tail gently. The girl hesitated for a moment, then reached out to pet him. As her small hand touched the puppy's head, her sobs broke free. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight. Whatever had brought her to this place, it had clearly left her terrified. But now that they had found her, one question burned in his mind. How had she ended up here alone? And what else was still hiding in the shadows of this forest? The girl's sobs slowly faded into quiet sniffles as she continued stroking Tucker's head. Her touch was hesitant but comforting, as if clinging to the pup was the only thing grounding her in the moment. Daniel remained crouched a few feet away, giving her space. He knew better than to push too hard. In his years on the force, he had seen fear like this before, fear rooted in trauma. Whoever she was, whatever had happened to her, it would take time for her to open up. "Hey, you're doing great," Daniel said gently. "You don't have to talk right now, but I want you to know you're safe. No one's going to hurt you." He paused, observing her reaction. She didn't move away but kept her eyes on Tucker, occasionally glancing at Daniel with a wary expression. Slowly, she seemed to relax, her small shoulders losing some of their tension. After a long moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Tucker?" Daniel smiled softly. "Yeah, I just started calling him that. He found me earlier today. Smart little guy, isn't he?" Tucker barked quietly in response, as if confirming Daniel's words. The girl managed a faint smile, though the fear in her eyes didn't completely vanish. Daniel knew that small connection was a step forward. He seized the moment. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated but finally answered, her voice still trembling. Emily Carson." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the name. A missing persons report had been filed for Emily Carson nearly a month ago in a neighboring county. Her disappearance had baffled local authorities. No leads, no witnesses, no sign of where she might have gone. Yet here she was, deep in the woods of Meadow Creek, miles from where she had last been seen. He kept his expression neutral, not wanting to alarm her. "Emily, I've heard about you. A lot of people have been worried, trying to find you. Your family's been looking everywhere." At the mention of her family, Emily's expression darkened. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, her face tightening in fear. Tucker whimpered softly and nuzzled her hand, sensing her distress. Daniel noted the sudden shift in her demeanor. Something wasn't right. He leaned in slightly, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Emily, you're safe now, but I need to understand what happened. How did you get all the way out here?" he asked softly. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different, heavy with fear and confusion. She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. I don't remember. I just ran. I didn't know where to go. He told me to run." Daniel's mind raced at those words. He told me to run. Who was he? Someone had been with her and possibly still was. The forest suddenly felt heavier, as though unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. Whatever had happened to Emily, Daniel was certain it wasn't over. He stood slowly, his senses on high alert. They needed to get out of these woods, and soon. Daniel's mind raced as he processed Emily's words. Someone had told her to run. That meant she wasn't alone when she disappeared, and whoever it was could still be out here. He quickly scanned the surrounding trees, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his sidearm. The forest was quiet, but that silence felt wrong, almost suffocating. Tucker stood alert beside Emily, his ears perked and his body tense. The puppy sensed the shift in Daniel's demeanor and stayed close to the girl. Daniel crouched again, keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "Emily, you said someone told you to run. Who was it? Was it a man? Someone you knew?" Emily shook her head quickly, her eyes darting around the clearing. "I didn't know him. He found me when I got lost. He said he would help me, but then he got scared. He said they were coming." Her voice trembled with each word. "They?" Daniel's eyebrows furrowed in concern. He leaned in slightly. "Who did he mean? Did you see anyone else?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "No." But he was afraid. He kept looking over his shoulder. "He told me to hide and not come out until it was safe. But I got scared and ran." Daniel's pulse quickened. Whoever had been with her clearly believed there was a threat in the woods. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter right now. What mattered was getting Emily to safety. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her frightened gaze. "You did the right thing by staying safe. But now we need to get out of here, okay? We'll talk more once we're safe. Emily nodded slowly, her grip tightening on Tucker's fur. He stood and surveyed their surroundings again. The forest seemed to press in on them from all sides, shadows shifting in the fading light. Every rustle of leaves or creak of a branch set his nerves on edge. "Let's move, but stay close to me," he instructed firmly. Tucker barked softly, signaling his readiness. Daniel led the way, his senses on high alert as they made their way back toward the trail. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step Daniel, Emily, and Tucker took. The canopy above became a thick blanket, blocking out most of the fading daylight. Shadows stretched long and thin across the trail, shifting like specters with the swaying of the trees. Daniel's hand hovered near his holster, his ears straining to catch even the faintest sound. The silence had returned, but it was far from comforting. It was oppressive, as if the woods were holding its breath. Emily walked close to Tucker, her small hand gripping his fur tightly. The puppy kept his head low, ears twitching at every sound, his instincts clearly on edge. Daniel glanced back at the girl and noticed how her eyes darted nervously from tree to tree. She was looking for something, or someone. He knew that kind of fear. She had seen too much and was expecting danger to appear at any moment. "Daniel," Emily whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. "Yeah, kiddo," he replied, keeping his voice calm. She hesitated for a moment, then pointed toward a cluster of trees off to their right. I think someone's there," she said shakily. Daniel followed her gaze, his muscles tensing as he scanned the area. He couldn't see anyone, but the dense shadows made it hard to tell. He crouched and spoke softly to her. "Stay right here with Tucker. Don't move unless I say so, okay?" Emily nodded, her wide eyes fixed on the dark space between the trees. Daniel rose and took a few careful steps toward the area she had pointed to. His boots pressed silently into the damp earth as he narrowed his eyes, focusing on any movement. A cold chill ran down his spine when he noticed the faintest shift of shadows, a figure moving quietly between the trees. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was there watching them. "Who's out there?" Daniel called firmly, his voice cutting through the stillness. The shadows didn't respond. For a moment, everything was silent. Then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling as the figure retreated deeper into the woods. Daniel's instincts told him not to give chase. Whoever was out there knew the forest better than he did. He turned back to Emily and Tucker, his expression grave. "Let's move," he said quickly, motioning for them to follow. "We're not alone out here." Emily's face paled, and she clung to Tucker as they hurried along the trail. Daniel kept a steady pace, glancing frequently over his shoulder. The sense of being watched didn't fade, it intensified. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally at the edges of his vision, and he knew without a doubt that someone or something was tracking their every move. Daniel quickened his pace, his senses on full alert. The weight of the forest seemed to press down on them, every step accompanied by the eerie feeling of unseen eyes watching their every move. Emily stumbled slightly over a root, and Tucker quickly circled back to nudge her forward. Daniel reached out to steady her, whispering urgently, "We need to keep going. Just a little farther. Okay? You're doing great." Emily nodded silently, tears welling in her eyes as fear clawed at her thoughts. Behind them, a sound shattered the stillness, a snapping branch. Daniel's body stiffened as he spun around, his hand instinctively gripping his firearm. He scanned the darkened woods but saw nothing. Then, from deep within the trees, came another sound, footsteps, faint but deliberate. Whoever was out there was no longer trying to remain hidden. "Tucker, stay close," Daniel ordered. The puppy barked, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the trees. Emily gasped and clung to Daniel's arm, her small body trembling. "Daniel, is it them? Are they coming?" she whispered, her voice cracking with panic. "I don't know," Daniel replied truthfully. He had no idea who or what they were dealing with, but one thing was certain. They were being hunted. "We're not stopping. Let's move." He kept Emily close as they hurried down the path, his mind racing with possible scenarios. Was this the man who had told Emily to run? Or were there more people out here, hidden in the vast wilderness? The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping, and distant, muffled voices echoed through the woods. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He could tell they were being herded, driven toward some unknown point. He cursed under his breath and tightened his grip on Emily's hand. They needed to break the pattern, escape the trap that was closing in around them. Suddenly, the path split ahead. Without hesitation, Daniel pulled them to the left, veering off the main trail. "Stay with me," he called out, glancing back to ensure Tucker and Emily were keeping pace. They dashed through the underbrush, pushing through low-hanging branches and uneven terrain. Tucker led the way now, his sharp instincts guiding him through the maze of trees. The sounds of pursuit faded slightly but did not disappear entirely. Whoever was chasing them was relentless, and Daniel knew they didn't have much time to find safety. Daniel pushed forward through the dense underbrush, his breath coming in sharp, controlled gasps. Emily clung tightly to him, her small feet stumbling over roots and rocks as they ran. Tucker led the way, his body low to the ground, ears alert, weaving between the trees like he knew exactly where to go. The forest seemed endless, each shadow stretching like fingers grasping at their path. The sounds of pursuit continued, distant but persistent, a grim reminder that they weren't safe yet. "Almost there," Daniel muttered, though he wasn't sure if it was to reassure Emily or himself. He kept glancing behind him, catching glimpses of flickering movement between the trees. The figures moved silently now, but he could feel their presence pressing closer. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to get Emily out of this nightmare before it was too late. Suddenly, Tucker barked sharply from up ahead, breaking Daniel's racing thoughts. The dog had stopped at the edge of a clearing. Sunlight streamed through a break in the trees, illuminating a small, open field surrounded by thick foliage. It was the first clear space they had come across in what felt like hours. Daniel rushed forward, pulling Emily alongside him. As they crossed into the clearing, he turned and drew his weapon, positioning himself between the woods and the girl. His senses were on fire, every nerve primed for a confrontation. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest remained still, as if whoever had been following them had stopped just short of the clearing's edge. Daniel scanned the tree line, his finger resting on the trigger, ready for anything. Minutes passed in tense silence. Slowly, the oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade. The woods seemed to release their breath, the unseen presence retreating deeper into the shadows. Emily collapsed onto the grass, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Tucker trotted to her side and licked her hand gently, earning a weak but relieved smile from the girl. Daniel lowered his weapon and knelt beside her. "We're safe for now," he said softly. His words felt more like a prayer than a statement. He didn't fully understand who or what had chased them, but he knew one thing for sure. Someone had been trying to protect Emily from something much larger than they had realized. Sirens broke through the quiet moments later. The distant wails of approaching police vehicles echoed through the forest, signaling that backup had finally arrived. Daniel stood, relief washing over him as he spotted flashing lights in the distance. "Help's here," he told Emily, who nodded tiredly. He glanced down at Tucker, who wagged his tail and barked once. They had made it out together, but Daniel knew the journey wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, mysteries buried deep in those woods. But for now, they had survived, and that was all that mattered.